The Salvation Army Thrift Store. We're not for profit. We're for taking on the school year in style. For great first days back and for putting your best foot forward, especially if it happens to be in a pair of retro high tops. We're for surprising finds at surprisingly great prices. For making this school year your year. At the Salvation Army Thrift Store, we're not for profit. We're for good. Shop your back-to-school style at the Salvation Army Thrift Store near you.
La infancia está llena de grandes sentimientos y la paternidad también. A veces, las familias necesitan ayuda para navegar esos grandes sentimientos, los que provocan muchas emociones y preocupaciones. Bright Life Kids puede ayudar. En asociación con CalHope, todas las familias de California con niños de 0 a 12 años pueden recibir coaching en línea gratis sobre salud conductual a través de sesiones en vivo. Obtenga todas las herramientas para todos los sentimientos en brightlife.kids.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave us a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits, including personal shoutouts, early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and more. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. And as always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Content warning. This episode contains descriptions of graphic violence towards animals, men, women, and children. This episode also includes discussions about necrophilia and cannibalism. Listener discretion is advised. Sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. To date, I've covered a variety of topics and stories here on the Red Treehouse. Ghosts, exorcisms, cryptids, and more. But as of now, I've yet to cover a topic that I find truly intriguing: vampires. I'm sure we're all familiar with the creature of the night, whose bloodthirst brings immortality at the expense of an unwilling victim. What's fascinating about media depictions of vampires is the reason behind their actions vary significantly. In some cases, vampires are romantic and sensual, and motivated by love. In other cases, vampires are vengeful, seeking revenge on a centuries-old grudge. And still in other cases, vampires are downright evil. They kill simply because they want to. But in all cases, we know they're an interesting and scary part of folklore. And they're not real. Except maybe they are. At least in this one instance. In the 1970s, Sacramento, California was tormented by Richard Trenton Chase, a serial killer who drank the blood of his victims, practiced necrophilia, and cannibalized their body parts. He is often referred to as the Vampire Killer of Sacramento. And make no mistake, his reign of terror is the stuff of the worst, most gruesome nightmares. Though I gave a content warning at the start of this episode, I'll give another one here. And in fact, I'll give at least one more later in the episode. The details of Richard Chase's crimes are graphic and horrifying. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the life and crimes of Richard Trenton Chase, a real-life, flesh and blood human monster who committed some of the worst atrocities. Who was the vampire killer of Sacramento? I'll share the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. The story of Richard Trenton Chase began on May 23, 1950, in Sacramento, California, to parents Richard and Beatrice Chase. The first few years of Richard's life were largely uneventful, as the young family lived and worked in Santa Clara County. When Richard was 3 years old, the family moved into their first home, and within a year, his sister Pamela was born. On the surface, the family appeared to be typical. Both parents worked to provide for their children and to build a life for themselves. But below the surface, Richard suffered abuse at the hands of his parents. One article stated, quote, "Richard's parents were strict disciplinarians who doled out punishment regularly. When he was only 2 years old, he was force-fed by his father until he vomited." Pamela Chase would later recall confrontations between her brother and their father that ended with Richard Sr. shaking the boy or throwing him against the wall. Richard Sr. was allegedly also emotionally abusive and yelled at his son whenever the boy messed something up. End quote. It is reported that Richard Sr. struggled with managing money and with alcoholism, leading to loud arguments with Beatrice in front of Richard Jr. and Pamela. For her part, Beatrice often accused Richard Sr. of infidelity, using drugs, and trying to poison her. While the storms raged in the home, Richard Jr. became quiet and withdrawn, and he began to act out in distressing and disturbing ways. He began setting small fires. He went to bed. And he displayed cruelty toward animals. In 1963, psychiatrist J.M. McDonald published an article in the American Journal of Psychiatry entitled "The Threat to Kill," in which he proposed 3 factors that may be predictive of violent tendencies. The first is bedwetting past the age of 5. The second is setting fires or pyromania. The third is cruelty towards and killing of small animals. These 3 are commonly known as the McDonald Triad, and were accepted as valid markers for sociopathy and homicidal tendencies. In his article, McDonald wrote, quote, "The writer, from clinical experience in examining over 100 persons who committed homicide, has the clinical impression that a history of great parental brutality, extreme maternal seduction, or the triad of childhood fire setting, cruelty to animals, and enuresis are unfavorable prognostic factors in those who threaten homicide." End quote. Ensuing decades have brought further studies and scrutiny. End quote. Subsequent research has generally not validated this line of thinking. End quote. we will explore the McDonald Triad in more detail in an upcoming episode of the Red Treehouse. As the family's home life deteriorated, Richard's odd and disturbing behaviors became more evident and were also ignored. Despite Richard's increasingly disturbing behavior, his strict father refused to get him help. And by the time Richard was 10 years old, he was torturing, killing, and disemboweling neighborhood animals. One article stated, quote, "It started with cats, but Richard would later begin killing birds, rabbits, and dogs." At one point, the young boy had killed so many stray cats that neighbors took notice of their sudden disappearances. Among her flowers, Beatrice found one buried in the soil. End quote. As Richard grew into his teenage years, he turned to drugs and alcohol, and quickly became addicted to psychotropic drugs, which only exacerbated his mental health struggles. As he matured, Richard developed hypochondria, which according to the Mayo Clinic, is defined as a, quote, illness anxiety disorder, sometimes called hypochondriasis or health anxiety, is worrying excessively that you are or may become seriously ill. You may have no physical symptoms, or you may believe that normal body sensations or minor symptoms are signs of severe illness, even though a thorough medical exam doesn't reveal a serious medical condition. End quote. Over the years, Richard was convinced he suffered from a variety of supposed medical conditions, including telling his doctors his pulmonary artery had been stolen, claiming his blood was turning to powder, and believing his cranial bones, the bones composing his skull, were separating and moving around. With the last one, Richard shaved his head to watch this happen and held oranges to his head, as he believed the vitamin C in the fruit would be absorbed into his brain. Despite his substance abuse and mental health struggles, Richard had several girlfriends throughout high school, but he was unable to maintain steady relationships, in part due to his, quote, inability to achieve or maintain an erection, and because of an inability to become arousing in the presence of females, end quote. Richard eventually went to see a psychiatrist and was told that his erectile dysfunction was likely due to repressed rage or underlying mental illness. After receiving this information, Richard did not seek additional help or treatment, and it would be determined, much too late, that he could only achieve arousal and orgasm through, quote, inflicting pain, suffering, or humiliation on others, end quote. Richard Chase was a budding sexual sadist. As Richard moved into adulthood, his untreated mental health struggles and ongoing drug and alcohol use only deepened his problems. At age 21, Richard was living with roommates in an apartment, but they quickly grew tired of his behavior and eventually moved out. Unable to manage the cost of living, Richard moved out of the apartment and back in with his parents. Before long, though, his father kicked him out and put up the rent for an apartment, where Richard lived alone. For years, Richard had been fascinated with blood, his own and that of animals. Coupled with his hypochondria and sexual impotence, Richard's behavior devolved into dangerous obsessions. He continued to catch, torture, kill, and disembowel neighborhood animals. Except now, he took it to the next level. Richard began eating the animals, raw. On several occasions, he placed the entrails of disemboweled animals into a blender mixed with Coca-Cola, which he then blended and consumed. Richard reasoned that the smoothies would prevent his, quote, heart from shrinking. He feared that if it shrank too much, it would disappear, and then he would die, end quote. Believing that his impotence was due to low blood volume, in 1975, Richard did something unimaginable to most of us. He injected himself with rabbit's blood, resulting in a severe case of blood poisoning. Because of this incident, Richard was involuntarily admitted to a psychiatric hospital, where he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He escaped and went to live with his mother, who by this time had divorced Richard Chase Sr. He was eventually caught and, quote, sent to an institution for the criminally insane, where he often shared with the staff fantasies about killing rabbits, end quote. While there, Richard managed to capture 2 birds who'd perched near his bedroom window. He then snapped their necks and drank their blood. On other occasions, hospital staff found Richard with blood smeared on his face and near his mouth, and they quickly began calling him Dracula. By 1976, after undergoing intense treatment and being prescribed medication, Richard was no longer deemed a threat to society and was released into his mother's custody. Within a short time, though, she determined Richard no longer needed the medication and weaned him off of it. Richard, for his part, accused his mother of attempting to poison him. Eventually, Richard's parents paid rent for an apartment, and he moved out with several friends. And he picked up where he left off. Richard began catching, torturing, killing, and eating rabbits, dogs, and cats, including those of his neighbors. He walked naked around the apartment, and his roommates, once again disturbed by Richard's behaviors, moved out. And once again, Richard Chase lived alone with no oversight or support. It was around this time that Richard began developing an obsession with firearms. He purchased several and began practicing regularly. His schizophrenia untreated, Richard started to believe he was a victim of a Nazi UFO conspiracy, and that the Hillside Stranglers, Angelo Buono, and Kenneth Bianchi were also victims of this conspiracy. As Richard fell further into his delusions, his personal hygiene and sense of self-care diminished. He stopped bathing, shaving, and brushing his teeth. He grew his hair long and scraggly, and he stopped eating and lost a considerable amount of weight, leaving him gaunt. In 1977, Richard visited his mother's home and rang the doorbell. When she opened the door, he pushed a dead cat towards her and eventually threw it to the ground, where he, quote, knelt down, ripped its stomach open with his bare hands, and stuck his hands inside the cat, smearing its blood all over his face while screaming, end quote. On August 3, 1977, Nevada State Police discovered Richard's Ford Ranchero trapped in a sand drift near Pyramid Lake, Nevada. Inside the vehicle were clothing, rifles, and a bucket full of blood and a cow's liver. Police officers were able to track down Richard Chase, where they found him screaming, naked, and covered in blood from head to toe. Upon questioning, Richard claimed it was cow's blood, and he was subsequently let go. Within a few months, Richard Chase would unleash the worst kind of hell on Sacramento, California. To this point, I've already given 2 content warnings, but I'll offer a third as we move into the next segment. Richard Chase committed some of the worst atrocities against human beings. The following contains extremely graphic descriptions of murder, necrophilia, and cannibalism against men, women, and children. Listener discretion is advised. On December 27, 1976, police responded to the home of a Sacramento woman who reported someone firing a bullet into her home from the street. Police conducted a search of the home and found a .22 caliber slug in the kitchen. Thankfully, no one was harmed in the incident. And though police didn't know it at the time, Richard Chase not only fired into the home, but the incident would set the stage for a horrific escalation over the next 30 days. On December 29, 1976, 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin was murdered in a drive-by shooting as he helped his wife bring in groceries from the car. Griffin was a husband and father of 2 children, and one of his sons reported seeing a neighbor walking around with a .22 caliber rifle. Police tracked down the individual, and though they determined the rifle was not used in the crime, police discovered that the .22 caliber bullet that killed Ambrose Griffin matched the .22 caliber slug taken out of the woman's kitchen a few days before. 2 weeks later, on January 11, 1977, Richard Chase attempted to enter the home of another woman, but decided to move on after discovering it was locked. In a chilling statement after his arrest, Richard Chase told police detectives, quote, that he took locked doors as a sign that he was not welcome, but that unlocked doors were an invitation to come inside, end quote. Undeterred by the locked door, Chase simply walked down the street where he found another home unlocked. Once inside, he, quote, stole some of their valuables, urinated into a drawer of their infant's clothing, and defecated on their son's bed, end quote. The homeowners came home while he was still there, and the husband scuffled with Chase, who subsequently escaped and evaded capture. On January 21, 1977, Richard Chase made his way to the home of David and Teresa Wallen. At the time of the crime, David was at work, and Teresa, who was 3 months pregnant, was taking out the trash. Seeing the door unlocked, Chase snuck into the home, and after surprising Teresa, shot her 3 times, twice in the head and once in the hand. She died instantly. After killing Teresa, Richard Chase moved her body to the bedroom, where he sexually assaulted her corpse while stabbing it with a butcher knife. He then placed a bucket under the body, carved open her torso, and removed several of her internal organs, the bucket collecting the blood. He then went to the bathroom, where he bathed himself in her blood. Before leaving the Wallens' home, Richard Chase drank some of Teresa's blood in a used yogurt cup and went out to the backyard, found dog feces, went back inside, and placed them in her mouth and throat. 2 days later, on January 23, 1977, Richard Chase purchased 2 puppies from a neighbor. He then killed the dogs, drank their blood, and left the remains on the neighbor's front porch. 4 days later, on January 27, 1977, 1 month after the first drive-by shooting, Richard Chase committed his final murders, a mass murder, at the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Maroth. At the time of the crime, Evelyn was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew David. Also in the home were Evelyn's 6-year-old son Jason and a neighbor, Dan. As Richard Chase entered Evelyn Maroth's home, Dan heard the commotion at the front door. He quickly got up to see what was going on, and as he approached the front hallway, he was surprised by Richard Chase, who shot him in the head at point-blank range. Evelyn's son Jason immediately ran towards his mother's bedroom, but Richard Chase shot him twice in the head at point-blank range. On his way to find Jason, he also shot David in the head, killing him instantly. After killing the boys, he found Evelyn in her bedroom and shot her once in the head at point-blank range. What Richard Chase did next was pure evil. He sexually assaulted Evelyn's corpse, and after making a series of cuts, drank the blood from her neck. Richard Chase then stabbed Evelyn, quote, at least half a dozen times, end quote, causing the blood to pool on her abdomen. He found a bucket to catch the blood, and then consumed it. Then, Richard Chase went to David's corpse, and after taking David to the bathroom, he split his skull open and ate a portion of his brain. He fled the scene after being startled by a playmate of Jason's, who knocked on the front door. The visitor called police, who upon discovering the grisly crime scene also noted the killer left full hand and shoe prints in blood. Richard Chase took David's corpse home with him when he left Evelyn Maroth's home, setting off a massive search for both the killer and the child. While at his apartment, Richard Chase brutalized David's corpse, removing several internal organs and consuming them. David's body was found several months later behind a church building. Before the mass murder, the FBI was called in to investigate and develop a profile of the killer. With stunning accuracy, the profile stated, quote, the killer would be tall, malnourished, a loner, physically unclean, and that most importantly, he would continue to kill, end quote. On February 1st, 1977, 5 days after the mass murder, police received a tip from Nancy Holden, a former classmate of Richard Chase. She suspected he might be the wanted murderer, and after running a background check on him, police thought he might be as well. They discovered the registration of his .22 caliber pistol, and within minutes, were knocking on Richard Chase's front door. When they asked to speak with him, he initially refused. But rather than leave the premises, detectives hid down the hallway and waited for him to leave the apartment, where they arrested him. His clothing and shoes were covered in blood, and he was holding a blood-stained box. Inside the box was the .22 caliber handgun which he'd used to commit the murders. It too was covered in blood. Initially, he denied wrongdoing, saying the blood came from a dog. But when police searched Richard Chase, they found he was carrying Dan Meredith's wallet. Now, with enough probable cause to search his apartment, detectives made entry, and what they discovered was among their worst nightmares. The inside of Richard Chase's apartment, walls, floor, ceiling, appliances, plates, cups, and eating utensils were covered in blood. On the kitchen counter, caked in coagulated blood, was the blender he used to make his smoothies. Inside the refrigerator, police found animal parts wrapped in aluminum foil. They found portions of David's, Evelyn Maroth's, and Teresa Wallen's body wrapped in saran wrap. And, in a small Tupperware, they found pieces of David's brain. On May 8, 1979, jurors found Richard Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder, with a death sentence in the gas chamber. Defense attorneys initially tried to have the charges reduced to second-degree murder, as it carried a life sentence rather than the death penalty. This was denied. Then, after his conviction was announced, defense attorneys asked for a clemency hearing, during which a judge ruled Richard Chase was not legally insane. In prison, Chase's reputation preceded him. Inmates knew the details of his crimes and were too scared to get close to him. Some tried to convince him to commit suicide, as they were too scared to kill him. On December 26, 1980, almost 4 years to the day of the start of his crime spree, a prison guard, quote, doing cell checks, found Chase lying awkwardly on his bed, not breathing. An autopsy determined that Chase committed suicide with an overdose of prison doctor-prescribed antidepressants that he had been saving up for the last few weeks, end quote. On that day, Richard Trenton Chase's reign of terror finally came to an end. To say this story was a lot might be a huge understatement. If this were a fictional story, it would have been a lot to take in. That it happened in real time to real-life people makes it almost unbelievable. There are a lot of terrifying aspects to this story, but for me, there are a few things that stand out. First, Chase's victims were regular people doing regular things, bringing in groceries, taking out the trash, or hanging out at home. Second, Richard Chase walked onto their property and into their home. A place that should be a sanctuary and refuge was turned into a house of horrors. And third, he was indiscriminate in his killing. There was no code where he refused to kill women and children. Richard Chase was an opportunist who had no regard for human life, and who would have likely continued killing had he not gotten caught. It's important to understand that Richard Chase was the exception, not the norm. He had significant mental health issues, including schizophrenia. And while he perpetrated the worst forms of violence, Richard Chase is not representative of schizophrenics. In fact, according to the National Institutes of Health, quote, although the majority of patients with schizophrenia are not actually violent, an increased tendency toward violent behaviors is known to be associated with schizophrenia. There are several factors to consider when identifying the subgroup of patients with schizophrenia who may commit violent or aggressive acts, end quote. The next statement is important if we are to avoid wrongly stereotyping those who struggle with this disorder. The article continues, quote, comorbidity with substance abuse is the most important clinical indicator of increased aggressive behaviors and crime rates in patients with schizophrenia. Management of comorbid substance use disorder may help prevent violent events and overall aggression, end quote. Richard Trenton Chase had significant mental health struggles for sure, but he also had significant substance abuse struggles as well. And while we might not know the answer to the age-old debate about nature versus nurture, we can be sure of one thing. Richard Chase was a real-life human monster. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with a lingering and likely unanswerable question. Was Richard Trenton Chase born a sociopath? Or did the trauma of his childhood and subsequent substance abuse contribute to a mental break and result in the most despicable crimes in recent memory? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.